Hello listeners, I am your speaker Casey, and as many of you may know, I am currently undertaking the Psychology of Coercive Control Master's course at Salford University. I hope that this course will make me more informed and better equipped for future projects and interviews on the podcast. In the meantime, I will be releasing renewed versions of older episodes with updates from previous guests. If you want to find out what I remember from the time of each interview and get in-depth updates from the guests, I've been writing blog posts as I go through older episodes and adding them to my website, cultvaultpodcast.com, which you can also find links to in the episode description. You can find links on my website for support on navigating recovery from cultic abuse, to learn more about how to help a loved one, or become more informed about the subject of cults and coercive control. My emails are still open, and I am carefully curating a list of guests to speak with once I am back to interviewing officially next year. You can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com if you'd like to get in touch. And now, on to today's updated episode.
So hi, Daniella, and thank you so much for joining us today. Would you like to start by introducing yourself?
Sure. Thank you for having me. My name is Daniella Mestyanek Young, and I am, quite complicated, but I am a third-generation survivor of the religious sex cult, the Children of God. And I am a U.S. Army veteran. I was an Army captain, an intelligence officer, and one of the first women to do deliberate ground combat, which really was infiltrating into a whole other kind of group within a group. And now I am an author. I'm an author and a speaker. I have a book called Uncultured coming out next year. I'm also a graduate student at Harvard studying organizational psychology, which is really just, why do groups exist and why do humans do the things they do within groups? At least that's how I'm applying it.
That is some introduction. That there is so much to unpack in what you've just said, and I am really looking forward to getting into all of it. Let's start at the beginning and talk about who are the children of God.
Yeah, so the Children of God sort of started as your run-of-the-mill, new religious movement is what the scholars will call it. And in the late 60s and early 70s, as people may or may not know, there was a lot of that going on. There was a lot of sort of disillusionment of that generation with what their parents, who'd grown up through the 30s, 40s, 50s, right, and sort of survived all of that, had built in the world around them. And so we saw, for many reasons, a lot of them social justice reasons, right? We saw like the hippies and Summer of Love and all that. And so in 1969, a man who was he was this 50-year-old sort of failed preacher, son of a big woman evangelical pastor, revivalist pastor, and he'd tried to start his own churches a few times and to not much success. And then he sort of found his little niche on Huntington Beach, California, passing out peanut butter sandwiches to hippies and getting them to come in for these Bible meetings with his 4 teenage children who were all very, young and cool. And he started really doing this different thing. He called himself a prophet very early on and had this big beard and would dress in sackcloth and was this whole message about, how Jesus is a revolutionary and Jesus is counterculture and Jesus is everything that the hippies were looking for. And he sort of, in my opinion, very expertly used this kind of searching nature of everyone, which incidentally is the one thing that researchers have found is the one quality of people that join cults is those people that are seekers, same thing that makes us lifelong learners, right, in normal worlds. But he was able to get, these whole groups of hippies to quit drugs, quit all the other things that was going on, and just get high on Jesus. And that's how it started. And he very quickly recruited thousands and thousands of people that were giving up everything, what they call dropping out of the system, which was, the name for the outside world, and coming to live in these communes. And then the beliefs evolved, and I guess I'll pause there and see if you have another question.
Yeah, I was just making notes here about its interest in the community group and the demographic that the leader targeted eventually to get this kind of movement rolling, like he tried so many times before, because I feel like there is always, with the groups that came about in the 60s and 70s, there's always the targeting of the kind of hippie, quote unquote hippie kind of counterculture movement, because those people were the seekers, and they were the people that were looking for something. So they were kind of almost ripe for these types of charismatic people to come in and promise them something that sounds absolutely amazing.
It's almost this interesting parallel, that I've seen in my life, which is like when we look at the American military and the people that end up in the military, right? It's a lot of times it's people that were just looking for a way out of their life, like the world they were raised in, for any number of reasons, right? There's this idea that it's only poor kids that join the military, and that's definitely not true. But it is definitely people that are like looking for something different and willing to make this huge drastic change in their life to go be a part of a group and put on a uniform and have a mission, right, that gives them this sort of greater sense of purpose.
Yeah,
and
absolutely. Yeah.
David Berg, to his credit, did that very well in the early 70s.
And that's the name of the leader of this movement.
That was the leader, yes, David Berg. And he, like I said, very quickly set himself up. He was the prophet of God. He spoke to God directly. We were the chosen people. He called himself, his first name was David, so he called himself Moses David, and then became Mo. And, our lives growing up, and we'll talk more about that. But he was called Dad by his followers, and then eventually called Grandpa by the children that were born in that world.
And that's interesting as well, because I've recently just finished some coverage on the Anthill Kids, and the leader of that movement, he also wanted to be addressed as Moses. So there is obviously something in that as well that comes with the territory of being one of these super controlling, charismatic leaders.
Oh, absolutely. You have to set yourself up as a prophet. And, if you want sort of the unquestioning obedience that cults rely on, and you have to, the easiest way to do that is to align yourself with some sort of already existing scripture, right? And you see this done a lot, and you see this in cult think, whether it's in an actual cult or not, but it's very easy to use a story people already know, a verse people already know, and just tweak it just slightly, or just corrupt it just a little bit so that people won't notice.
Yep.
And we'll talk about how he did that with the golden rule in the Bible to create a sex cult.
So there's lots of manipulation of scripture and using the words written in these holy books to justify sort of the things that were happening in this group. Okay, interesting. So you mentioned that this group started to pick up thousands of followers. So does that mean that it wasn't contained to the area it started in? Did it start to kind of expand and grow throughout the States? Did it grow throughout the world?
Yes, absolutely. So let me walk you through that, because it's also how my family gets involved. So it quickly began to grow, larger than they could contain. And of course, it's important to remember that nobody sets out to build a cult. Like, quite frankly, nobody's just that smart. So, he's building this group of all these people, and sort of realizes like, oh, none of them want to go home. Like, they believe this. They want to stay with me. Like we're building something cool here. And it really is startup energy at that time. It's like I, of course, also did 3 years in entrepreneurship world, education world, startup world, just to round it out, And it's very much that same energy, right? It's we're going to dedicate our minds, hearts, bodies, and souls to getting this new organization off the ground, getting it running, making it a thing. And so he moves his followers to Texas, where there is this man named Fred Jordan, who has a big radio station at the time, all religious sort of preaching stuff, and who thinks he's great, and who's like who's sort of willing to like partner with him as he's starting up his thing. It actually very much reminds me of when bin Laden moved to Afghanistan and got involved with Haqqani, the leader there, who was like, yeah, okay, you're kind of like a weird startup kid, but like, I'll give you a chance. I'll throw my lot in with you. And that was sort of, what David did. And so Fred Jordan gave him this huge ranch that they called the Texas Soul Clinic. And this was, think very much sort of Waco, the Branch Davidians, just like dilapidated, sprawling, where you're just stacking teenagers, because that's really what they are at this point. You have they were recruiting very, very young people, right? So you're talking like 16 to 25-year-olds. And so my grandfather gets involved. I believe he's about 22. He's one of the few people that joins with a college degree in finance. He's a CPA. And so he immediately gets sort of sucked up right into the leadership. And my great-grandmother, so there was this whole group of parents who supported the Children of God, right? Because they liked their lost, drugged out hippie kids getting involved and getting high on Jesus. David Berg called it. And so my great-grandmother, her name was Mrs. Ingersoll, she becomes quite famous in the cult because she donates a house to Berg.
Wow, okay.
And it's actually this like very nice house that Berg goes off to live in while all of his followers are like in this sort of awful compound. And I'm not saying it was a quid pro quo deal, but it was very much my great-grandmother's daughter, who of course becomes my grandmother, had a history of sort of mental instability and illness and just was a difficult teenager. And my great-grandmother was more than happy for her to sort of be offloaded at 17 or 18 to follow this man who was trying to do good things in the world and this community that was going to take care of her. And my grandparents were already together at the time, so she was sort of essentially following her older boyfriend into this.
Right. Okay. So I thought that you were going to say that once your great-grandmother had kind of passed this property over, that's how your grandparents met, but they're actually already together at this point. So that's how your great-grandmother becomes aware of the work that David is doing through your grandfather joining the group and at 22.
Yeah. That's probably 80% accurate. That's what I know.
Okay,
that's how I understand it, I would say.
And I can't believe she just gave over her house. I suppose at that time, though, having the responsibility of caring for a child with additional needs must have been extremely difficult in those times, because a lot of the conditions weren't even recognized, or if people had, no idea what level of support needed to be in place, or medication or intervention and all that type of stuff to kind of help families to work out methods of how to support people with additional needs.
Yes, exactly. And if you think about it, what the teenagers in the 70s were going through, like a lot of that is not that much different than some of the millennials or Gen Z is going through now. I think there's a reason we're revisiting all these same social issues. There's a reason some of us say the 2021s are going to be the decade of cults again.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, like these hippie kids, like they'd grown up with so much trauma in their lives and a world that, their parents had survived world wars and depressions and all of this stuff. And, weren't getting treatment or care or therapy or any of that on their own. And then they raised this generation that's sort of, all sorts of, not even necessarily messed up, right? But searching for like this world we were raised in. This is not it. This is not right. This is not what I'm spending my life just in the rat race right? Like, I'm going to go do something that matters.
Yeah, and when you meet a charismatic person that promises to deliver all of those things through the purity of God's work as well, quote unquote, then obviously that's going to sound appealing to a certain group of people who are looking and searching for all of those things. So it becomes very easy to see how these groups manage to almost rewire the brains of their followers during this period in time. And it is scary when you say that we are on the brink of a second surge of kind of cults and coercive groups, because every time I do research, all I keep hearing is that the world is rife for new religious movements to come through and take over the space that the groups did in the 70s and 80s. And obviously now we have the internet culture to go along with that as well, which is terrifying. And if I think about it, it gives me sort of existential terror. So I try not to too much.
Yeah, I mean, so, and I guess to put it in a little more context, right? If you think about it on a large scale, right? Anytime there's big societal change, you're gonna have these people sort of creating new spaces, right?
Yeah.
New ideas, new things, new thoughts. I think a lot of what my book is creating new thoughts and new theories about group behavior. And and that in and of itself is not bad, right? Creating new organizations, creating new things. It's when you add isolation, right? So you take a bunch of seekers and then you add isolation of thought to that. That's when it starts to become harmful. And I truly believe that's in any group, right? So I see it, I've seen it in the military, I've seen it other places, but that's what's happening now with silo culture in the US. And President Obama warned about this in his last address in office to the nation after, of course, the huge surprise upset of the Donald Trump election win. And let's face it, like, that man was the perfect cult leader from day one, textbook. I've been yelling about it from when I knew he was going to win the election to now.
Yep.
And President Obama warned us. He said, like, we are living in silos. Like, AI and technology is making it so that you don't have to see or hear any other voices that you don't want to. Mm-hmm. And that is exactly how people get radicalized. And that is exactly how, circular logic works. And it's safe and it feels nice to just only be surrounded with people that think exactly what you think.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what the Children of God did in the 70s and 80s. It was just a bunch, and think about it, it's fun, right? Take a bunch of like-minded teenagers, give them a purpose, put them on camping out on floors and like a hard life. And it's literally exactly the same as going to basic training, which is hard, but it's fun. And it's fun. And you come away with the camaraderie that is like no other. And that was when he started getting weird, right?
Okay.
Always weird, right? Yeah. So David Berg was always a extremely problematic, dysfunctional, pedophile, incest guy and alcoholic, right? He just managed to hide all of that. And it's a very interesting thing, I think, how people get pulled into cults and really just how cognitive dissonance works.
Yeah.
Right. And I'll give this parallel by talking about basic training, which in the Army, which I think a lot of people can just relate to a little bit better. So if you think about it, like when people have an idea, you're like, oh yeah, I believe that idea, right? And then you're introduced to evidence that doesn't make sense. Most people will be like, okay, yeah, I'll change my idea, right? Unless, because that's like cognitive dissonance is uncomfortable for us. So when we find new information that contrasts an idea or a value or belief we already hold, a lot of times we can just change that belief or value. But when you've been too public with it, right? Human beings want to avoid embarrassment and being wrong publicly as much as possible.
Yeah.
So this happens to people in basic training. Everybody, I would believe that if you did a survey, right? Everybody that gets to basic training at some point is like, what did I just do with my life? Like, I was a free person walking around on the streets, and then I just signed up to come here, sign away all my freedom, and just like be abused, right? Like, why did I do that? And some people cannot take it. And the first week of basic training, people are sort of like, they're mostly sort of like performative suicide attempts, because that's the easiest way to get sent home. But for the majority of people, you know, probably 90% or higher, like you don't just walk away because you made such a big deal in your world of going off to join the army, right? You left your family, you left your friends, you said goodbye, you gave up things, you gave up freedoms. So you show up and like a few things aren't like you expect. There's a pretty strong pull for you to just stay there and gut it out.
Yeah.
Because how embarrassing is it to put your tail between your legs and go home and basically say you failed out of the army?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so,
there's sunk cost fallacy, isn't there, in that sense, when you think about everything that you've given up to make that decision in the first place. And America's very different with its culture around the armed forces as well. You know, you watched, well, over here you would watch TV, you would watch films. When I go and visit, if there's a veteran, and everybody's always like, thank you so much for your service, which is not necessarily something that happens as much over here. So that pressure as well for the respect that you get from your countrymen in America, it's almost like you have that pressure from strangers and people you've never met before to kind of stick with that journey as well, and not be, you know, not have to say, well, actually, I went to basic training and I never completed it.
yeah, exactly. And so, you know, and let's not even get started, because we don't have time for that, on the problems of America and the deification of the military, right? I call it the cult of the veteran. It is extremely problematic.
Hey, that has a good ring to it, and I think that there could be some publishing potential in that title as well.
Yeah. At least an article or two for sure. But there's this analogy and sort of this scene that I'll tell you about that starts off my book, and then how it sort of relates back to the children of God, which is when you get to basic training, you know, basically the first thing that happens, you've been sleep deprived for 48 to 72 hours, which was similar to what the children of God would do with their religious revivals. Like, you're hungry, like basically all your physical needs just haven't been met for some days. And then you get off this bus and everyone is shouting at you. And you have this 50-pound duffel bag with all of your gear, and you have to just hold it above your head for about 2 to 3 hours, right? And it's literally a physically impossible event. Nobody can do it. It's so ridiculous. You're just dropping your bag, you're getting yelled at, you're picking it back up, you're sweating, you're crying. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And my opinion, knowing that basic training was designed by organizational psychologists to break you down and then build you back up as a team, is that that's exactly what this is designed for. It's such a ridiculous event if you think about it. Like, Casey, would you ever go outside and just hold 50 pounds above your head for 3 hours?
No.
You would never do that. It's a completely ridiculous thing for a human being to do. So why don't you just drop the bag and walk away? Right? And then it's because of that group mentality is already at work on you. And I suspect, and one day I will do research to this effect, but that the second you don't drop that bag and walk away, you have now bought into the group. Right. And now there's a psychological principle that is proven that applies, that human beings will do anything to be part of a group, accepted part of a group that they volunteered to join. Right. And so this is exactly what you have happening in the children of God in the 70s, is that all of these people have done exactly that, right? They've left their friends and families. I mean, it was complete, total cutoff. Like, if they are still in the system, we do not talk to them. God said, no man having put his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God, right? So all they're doing at this point is living in barracks. There's no sex, there's no drugs, there's no drinking. They're just all day long memorizing the Bible, the scripture. Like, you're not allowed to have an idle mind. Another big tool of programming. And another thing they also do in the military, like, there's no downtime. Like, you are always in a pair. You always have a buddy. So you can't question, you can't doubt. If you think of kind of like The Handmaid's Tale, where they always have to be paired up and go somewhere on their own. I don't know that I was ever alone till I left the cult.
Wow.
And you always have content going on in your brain, and you're getting sucked into this. And then, and you're getting, sort of to your point, that high status, high profile thing, right? You forsook all, they call it, to go become a missionary, right? And people get value. That's what they call themselves. They call themselves missionaries. People get value out of that. So in 70s, really, Berg starts to realize, I think, that he that people are drinking his Kool-Aid. Of course, he's also drinking his Kool-Aid, and this is very important to know about cult leaders, is that they believe it too. Yeah. Nobody is that good of a diabolical manipulator, right? Like, they believe it too. Mm-hmm. And so he starts with a lot of the sexual chicanery that has been going on in his own family, right? He's already been abusing his own daughters. He's already been forcing his sons to let him have sex with their wives. Right. And he starts to roll that out to the public. So the first thing he does is he banishes his wife that's his age, right? His 50-year-old wife, as she's not right with God. She's gone. She's the old church. God has told me to bring in the new church, and brings in his 20-year-old secretary, who becomes Mama Maria, and who is currently still the leader of this cult, who took over after his death. But she becomes a big part of it. And then when he sees his followers are fine with that, he starts to up the ante, and he starts to essentially pimp her out to other men to attract more converts. And I think this is done very cleverly. And if you look at entrepreneurship, when you start a new business, you have to differentiate yourself. You have to give yourself what they call the unique value proposition. And Berg realizes that sex is his thing. Right. And so he literally does this just out loud in public. He calls himself the sexy prophet. And please, if you're listening to this, go Google a picture of David Berg.
No, honestly, that just made my stomach turn when you said that.
The farthest thing from sexy you can possibly imagine. But he takes the story of Adam and Eve, and you remember how we were talking about, you take a well-known thing that people aren't going to question, and he says, the original sin wasn't sex. Right? The way churches have tried to say it was, which I don't even know if that's true. But he says the original sin was, questioning God, disobeying God, right? Oh, so he's inculcating these very important things to his followers. One is, don't ever question any God. And I've set myself up as God, as your prophet. I'm the mouthpiece of God. So don't ever question me. And also, sex is good, right? And he very quickly gets into interpreting the verse, right, that's referred to as the golden rule, which is, love God and love others as yourself. And some other verses in the Bible that say everything done in love is cool, essentially. St. Paul saying all things are lawful, but all things are not expedient, which he eventually uses to justify pedophilia. But right now we're still going in religious prostitution is what it becomes, right? And so he embraces that. He calls the women hookers for Christ. He has drawings done, and it's all based on this verse in the Bible that says, "I will make you fishers of men," to the fishermen that Jesus recruits to be his disciples. And he had these posters done of these naked women with like fish hooks coming through their chests, but looking all very sexy. And basically throughout the 70s, like all of the women in the Children of God are just expected to be religious prostitutes.
So he's also using the Adam and Eve scripture to justify women being lesser people than men, it seems, as well at this.
Oh, absolutely. And this is a big theme in my book, and some people like to fight with me about it because he did have women in leadership at all points. But absolutely, the old patriarchal and let's face it, very embedded in Christianity and most of the big five religions, that just women are lesser human beings. And so when I was growing up, is like, you are here to be a Bible woman. You are here to serve at the feet of men. You are here to be a handmaiden of David, King David in the Bible. You know, a lot of those analogies.
Yep.
And you just were not intended to question. And so, of course, religious prostitution to get converts in, as soon as he started going with sex and started realizing that people weren't going to complain, that's when it really became a thing. And it started to be called the sex cult, which it absolutely was. And he started to almost solely focus on sex. And so now all of a sudden it became what I think I have dubbed, I haven't heard anyone else use this term, but I call it forced polyamory. So just sort of to distinguish, like, people go straight to polygamy. And while like there was some, it was forced polyamory. Okay. So, and that also helped him avoid, like, how other cults like marry off their 14-year-old girls. Like, he didn't necessarily had to do that. He did play around with child brides when my mother was growing up, but he didn't have to do it because at whatever age, you just are expected to just be open for sex. And they started these things called the sharing schedules because you were sharing God's love, and all things done in love are cool. And it would literally be like, so, you know, commune life for these disciples at this point that are probably 10 years into this cult. So they're very bought in. And it's, you know, you wake up in the morning and you read the schedule and you see what chores you have that day and you see what tasks you're going to be doing, or they were called ministries. You know, maybe you're cooking for 200 people, or maybe you're out on the street passing out literature and begging for money. And then in the evening, who you're on the schedule to sleep with that night. Okay. You know, it was just that basic and common and known. And then, of course, the problem comes when kids start coming in, you know. Like, not that there wasn't a problem before, because as soon as you mix like sex and power dynamics, and I firmly believe that any organization that starts telling people who they can and can't sleep with is just setting up for very cult-like problems. And if you think about it, most religions, most organizations, and most of our cultures try to dictate sexuality or even
absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that's always problematic, especially when you have this very disturbing power dynamic where you really can't say just because they were adults, they were all choosing it, because at this point, like, we're well past that. However, children start coming in, right? And so I mentioned that I am a third generation, right? My grandmother and grandfather are in the cult at this point. And so my mom is born in 1972, right in the middle of all of this stuff. And she's very high up. We're very in the leadership and will remain so my whole life. And my mom was I believe one of the first like 10, and there were very few children in the beginning, but then there quickly started to be a lot, right? It was be fruitful and multiply. It was what sort of most religions realize as they're growing, as like in cultures just in general, like, we need to have as many children as possible to grow members. And so most families end up with, I mean, like 12 children is probably.
Yeah. I mean, even when you look at families who are devout Catholics, Catholicism has a lot of people just through the, you know, contraception rules that they have in place around not being able to, well, just not having access or allowed to use any kind of contraception. And then the families are huge. They have 10 to 15 children. And if you
I just went through trying to buy like a mother's necklace for my mom, and just like, nobody makes mother's necklace for cult survivors.
That's I can't imagine how. Oh my goodness. And in your TEDx talk, which we'll mention at the end, you asked the question, are there any cult survivors here? And one person puts their hand up, and you said, that's one of my ex brothers or sisters.
One of my 24 siblings. Yeah.
That's what you said. And I was like, I had to go back and re-listen. I was like, yeah. So
I know. I really didn't pause for effect there the way I should have.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh my goodness. So there's obviously, there's a lot to unpack in what you've just said. And I don't want to focus too much on the, as we spoke about before we pressed the record button, sort of the sensationalized side of the children of God, which a lot of it is obviously the abuse of children and the paedophilia and all of that nasty stuff that comes with talking about this movement, but it is still a core part of it. So it's interesting that somebody comes along, and I did a big segment on the Jehovah's Witnesses. I spoke to a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses, and a lot of the ex-members that have left are either people who identify as part of the LGBTQIA community and felt like they couldn't live authentically as a Jehovah's Witness through their kind of sexuality and who they wanted to spend their life with, but also a lot of people who identified as heterosexual left for the same reasons. They met someone outside of the church that they felt a connection with and wanted to spend their life with or have romantic involvement with, but were not allowed because the person was not a member of the Jehovah's Witnesses. So you've got somebody here who's coming to you and saying, forget everything you know about religion. If you want to be religious and you want to have loads of sex, you can come and do that with us right here, because that's what we do. So that is like, it's putting those two juxtaposing things together and saying like, you can have everything that you want and it's not a bad thing. You don't have to feel sinful. You can have a relationship with God, with Christ, and also, be involved in the bounty of all these women that I can promise you, which is so hard to wrap your head around.
Yes. And if you think about it, it's genius, right? It's, you can come in and you can be as passionately religious as you want to, and still also sort of have your sexual playground. That's the idea of it, right? Of course, in reality, it's a lot more mechanical and just gross. And, it's never, it's like the same thing, like when people think when they go to like a nudist beach or something, right? That it's just like a bunch of beautiful models walking around naked. And it's like, no, it's a bunch of normal people just sort of enjoying nature. But that's what definitely the children of God became, right? It's like, you can have polyamory and not have it be gross and problematic. I believe that, but I don't think you can do it at this like organizational, like group, like dictated level, right?
Timetabled and that.
And then I will also say, because you mentioned the LGBTQ community. So first of all, let me just take the opportunity for the listeners to say, a Children of God survivor named Lauren Huff has just published a book called Leaving Isn't the Hardest Thing, a book of essays. And she was also born and raised in it, second generation, so not third generation like me, but she was born and raised in the Children of God. She also served in the Air Force, and she's also a gay woman. And she talks about, right, like her struggles with that.
Okay.
And so Berg did draw the line at homosexuality. Berg pretty much drew the line at anything he didn't enjoy, right? So you're attracted to your own daughter. Okay, fine. I will tell you why God might be okay with that in Berg's mind, but you can't be gay. And definitely men could not be gay. And there was like a little bit of wiggle room for women because, Berg enjoyed that, but you couldn't be... Essentially, you could be bisexual, but you couldn't be exclusively gay.
Right.
Which, by the way, is sort of a good time to talk about the KGB-esque environment that grows in the cult, because anyone that has an issue with you can just complain about you to a shepherd, they called them, right? A leader, and it sort of will become this religious witch hunt. And I can definitely also tell you a lot of parallels about that in the U.S. Army, but maybe that's another time. But, you know, it becomes very much a thing. Like if you're a woman and you're engaging in sexual activity with another woman, that's fine. But if you're suspected of being a lesbian, that's a problem you're going to be expected to pray and have victory over. And so, you know, I definitely think the LGBT community was persecuted and hounded.
Yeah.
And in intense groups, it's really hard to be different. And if you're different, you're going to have a really hard life.
And I mean, it's there's obviously a lot to every survivor of this movement will have needed some type of assistance or some kind of self-help techniques or something process to overcome what they've been through. And I can't even imagine where you would start with something like that. But to be a woman like Lauren and to identify as part of that community group and then be forced to sleep with somebody of the opposite sex is like a whole other layer of I can't even begin to comprehend how that would affect somebody's psyche on top of the abuse that they're already being subjected to. So it must be a really eye-opening read. So I'll definitely post a link to that book in the episode description, because I think that might be of interest to some of the listeners. And
yes, it's very good. And, you know, her whole title, right? Leaving isn't the hardest thing. It's like all the work that you have to do after you've been through that. And just, you know, to sort of close out this question, right? If you talk about like the sex cult and all the stuff, right? Like I always, you know, people worry that it's sensationalizing, and I don't think it is, because it's the way it was. But it's important to talk about, like, for the children, for those of us growing up in it, it wasn't just the actual physical, like, sex or abuse or anything that was going on. Like some people, depending on where they grew up, like they maybe didn't actually get sexually abused. And if you talk to different Children of God survivors, some people like me will be like, absolutely 100% it was a sex cult. And other people will be like, no, it's just a little bit weird, but we were fine. But I think the important thing to note is that it was in everything. Sex was the doctrine. It was in the literature. It was in the games we played as children, you know, like you'd clean up the house after dinner when you're playing mommy and daddy, and then you would go off and make love, you know? And so there was no way around growing up in an absolutely over-sexualized environment.
Yeah. And it seems as if the overall vision, which unfortunately did seem to come to fruition for David, was for him to live out his horrible sexual fantasies. He just had to get everybody else on board and believe that it was okay, and then he could just live his life with everybody's blessing. So the whole point of it at the end, it doesn't seem to be directed towards helping his community in any way, just for him to be able to do what he wanted to do, because society, obviously, typical society, would not accept the themes and doctrine that he was trying to bring to the followers. And that's unfortunate, because as you said, when it started out, when everybody, you know, when you had all the teenagers sleeping on the floor and he's talking about building this utopia, you can see it in documentaries around Jim Jones and the People's Temple. People were ecstatic to be part of that community, to be part of building something that they thought was going to be better than their current life and all the bad things in the world. And they thought that they were going to be part of something that was going to be positive, that was going to be better, that was going to be good for the world. And there just has to be that one person that takes it too far and spoils it for everybody and changes the vision and the concept and
Right. And the problem is, yes, and the problem is that the original followers, for the most part, they couldn't see it, right? Like the cognitive dissonance was too large.
Yeah.
So to your point, like he not only built a world where he could do whatever he wanted, he built a world of 10,000 followers who the next revelation after, religious prostitution was send me videos of your young daughters dancing sexy, which, this is one of the sensational pieces that does make the news all the time. And then it was send me your daughters,
right.
And so my mother was one of 14 little girls that were sent to the prophet for training. My mother was one of the oldest. She was 13. The youngest was 3. And the two of the girls included were his own daughter and his own granddaughter. And he married them all in a, not legal, but religious ceremony. And the mother of the 3-year-old was the one who ran the ceremony. And to this day, she will not admit that there was anything problematic with his teaching. And this was the way it worked, right? Exactly what you said. It was like, we do this here because we have the prophet that has shown us the truth of God, but the outside world doesn't understand. So naturally, as soon as you open up sex with children, like you start to become a very, very insular organization, very secretive.
Yep.
Berg saw what was happening with Charles Manson and Jim Jones and all the sort of bad, cult stuff heating up. And he, very conveniently received a revelation from God that his followers needed to go abroad to the developing world and, go proselytize. And it turns out that everyone assuming fake Bible names and spreading out around the world is also a really good way to, hide from authorities.
Yeah, yeah.
And continue to grow. And so when I was born, give you a little background. So when my mom was 14, so she wasn't wasn't actually married to the prophet to be a permanent wife. It was just like a ceremony. Prophet can do whatever he wants. And then the girls go back home and they've received all this religious spiritual training. So at 14, my mom is impregnated actually by one of Berg's, his third, top lieutenant, basically, who is also a fellow finance guy and coworker of my grandfather and is also 5 years older than my grandfather. So my father is 5 years older than my grandfather.
Wow.
And so at 15, my mom gives birth to me, and I'm one of, again, the very first third generation. By the time I grew up and left, I was the oldest third generation who was still in.
Okay, so your grandparents are together, and your mum is born in 1972, and then 15 years later you are born.
So, and I'm born in 1987. Yes.
So, that's just. Oh my goodness. I mean, I've got a young mum. She had my sister when she was 17. But I can't imagine a parent. I mean, is your body even fully developed enough at that point to be
No, absolutely not.
I mean,
absolutely not.
So
and my mom has, I will say this, my mom has, she does her duty to God, and she has children every couple years. And by the time she's 30, she's on her 7th baby. And let's also mention, we were not well fed, we were very poor. And she has her 7th child has spina bifida, which is a body depletion birth defect, essentially, right? It's like you lack the right nutrients for your child to develop.
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously science is still learning all that stuff. But in my opinion, like you said, you can't start at 14, pump out 7 kids in 14 years and sort of expect there not to be any.
And for yourself to be okay as the parent as well. there's all sorts of stories about, you know, babies get smaller each time, and there's complications with the mother, and she's at risk of all sorts of complications through labor, because
we had a lot of birth defects and we had a lot of learning disabilities, and those children were very, very not well treated also, you know, in the cult. So, you know, I will say what happens when you're growing up in a cult is you don't get a childhood. Like you're not allowed to be a child. Like you are a perfect little soldier of God. And so from day one, you know, Berg's doctrine was 6-month-old babies are old enough to be spanked for misbehaving, right? And like everyone at all point has to be a perfect soldier. And I describe it now as a grown-up and as a mother of a very lively little 5-year-old. You know, the biggest problem with our lives wasn't even the abuse. It was just institutionalized life and no spontaneous moments of joy. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
You were allowed to be a child. And even when you were, like, even if one adult took you outside and said, run around, go crazy, have fun, there is no guarantee that another adult is not going to come out and get angry and punish all of you.
Mm-hmm.
And you just have to take it, right? So our childhoods growing up were just a mess of trying to follow every single rule when you don't even necessarily always know what the rules are.
Yeah. And that happens with a lot when there are children involved in these types of movements. And I've spoken a few times to people who are second or third generations of their particular group or movement, and we speak a little bit here and there about having to mourn the childhood that you didn't have, which is a very real thing. You know, even though you haven't physically lost a person, you have the right and probably do need to at some point address the fact that there is a huge portion of your life that was spent in a way it shouldn't have been, and that's a big thing, and something that I think a lot of people do end up having a grieving period around.
Yeah, you know, and so I'll talk about that a little bit in my life, but it's so important to go through that, right? Because it's also when you are born into a cult, you didn't go through that process of programming the adult way, right? Like that was just introduced to you as the way.
Yeah.
So you're like trying to learn, you know, so for example, like when I was 6 years old, I was like, this is it. I'm done. This is not God. I'm an atheist, essentially, right? But I didn't have the words for all of that. The only thing I could think to myself at the time, we called it the family internally, right? And so at the time, I was like, I don't care if I go to hell for leaving the family. Like hell's gonna suck, but I'm not doing this.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like that was the only thing I had to think. And I will definitely say that, so first of all, I had a very good therapist, thank you, U.S. Army, who had actually coincidentally done her internship in working with women and children from cults.
Yes.
And she is the one that told me that. She is the one that told me, like, you have to find, like you build, when you grow up in a cult, this also kind of applies to like children of important like politicians or generals or whatever, right? Like in any of these careers, diplomats, you know, where you're considered an extension of your parents and you're always supposed to, you know, we were supposed to be perfect little missionary kids that always just shine God's light onto people. And so you keep yourself perfect, right? So I get out, I put myself through high school in 2 years instead of 4. I put myself through college. I graduate valedictorian.
Yes.
I joined the Army. I'm the fastest runner. I'm the best at everything. And that's not a good thing, right? And that took me, like, the world sees it as a good thing, but it took me many, many years and actually reading this book called Third Culture Kids to realize that, like, children that come from these situations, like, we're obsessed with school because that's where we get love. You know, like that's where we get attention. Like we're obsessed with being the best because that's what we were taught to do. And my it was interesting, like through the process of, so I've written a book and we'll talk more about it, but it's a memoir called Uncultured, and I take you through all of it. And people have said to me, gosh, it's amazing how you can just write like a 6-year-old little girl. And I was like, well, as I was writing it, I had a 4-year-old little girl who looks exactly like me and is very much in personality like me. I call her the do-over baby. And I see, it's been such a different experience for me, kind of seeing again from another angle, like, one, why my childhood was so miserable, because I'm just an ADHD, like can't be controlled in an institutionalized environment kid, but also exactly what you said, right? That like I never had that childhood. And so I'll give you this moment, I was dressing up my daughter to go to a unicorn princess daddy-daughter ball in the military. So this beautiful little girl is dressed up like a unicorn princess, and her 6'2" blue-eyed dad is in his uniform, helicopter pilot, and they're going off to the ball. And I was like, I was being the normal American mom. I was taking all the pictures. I was doing all the things. And as soon as they drove off, I kind of like automatically thought to myself, like, as I was like going back to work, I was like, oh, remember the days when life was just being 3 and going to a dance with your dad? And then I was like, nope, I didn't have that childhood, and I immediately, right? It was one of the first times I think I noticed like being triggered like that bad and that hard, to where I was like, I need to go call friends and going to combatively drink and be a cult kid, and it really is a lot of that, right? Like the learning and the acceptance. For me in my 30s, it has been the acceptance of the fact that I was born in a cult. Somebody broke me. They stole my childhood, and no matter what I do, I never get to fix it.
No.
I'm always going to be kind of this shattered glass vase that was put back together. And I've put my life together with a lot of care, a lot of intentionality. I have a beautiful, wonderful life, but I still, parenting through it, it's been its own therapy, and it's been hard because when my daughter has these moments of unadulterated joy, I am so happy for her. But I am so like tragically sad for 6-year-old Daniella that didn't get to have those things, or 6-year-old my mom who didn't get to have those things.
Yeah. And I mean, you've got 24 brothers and sisters as well. So I mean, that must play a big part in all of it. And it just sounds like, I don't even know. I mean, it's so fantastic that you found that therapist, because we always say, like, try and find a therapist that has experience in, at least coercive control or even domestic abuse relationships, because I think a lot of the coping mechanisms and strategies for that type of controlling environment can help somebody that's come from a highly controlling movement. But where would a therapist even start with trying to help somebody with that realization of their childhood? That's obviously got me a bit teared up, because it's heartbreaking.
Yeah, that's such an important part, and I always say also to the survivors, and sort of once again, this can be true for veterans. It's like when you've had extreme sustained trauma in your life, and especially like institutionalized trauma, you have to go to a therapist that knows that.
Yeah.
So the last time I found a therapist, which I've had very good experience through the VA, but when I did my intake, I said, okay, this is my background. And they're like, what therapist do you want? And I was like, I want the therapist that reads this and says I can handle that.
Yeah.
Because if you just go to a random therapist, I've had this so many times where like the therapist cries and hugs me and tells me I'm a great person. Not that that's a bad thing, right? But it's just like they have no idea how to deal
Absolutely.
with that level of trauma. And that, yeah, it's totally different from, you know, I have a friend who lives in LA who's like, you got to be really careful about your therapist when you're a Children of God survivor. A lot of them go back to California, and they're like, because you don't want the rich, you know, the therapist who specializes in like rich white women in LA that feel too stressed out with their Hollywood lives. You have to find someone who's really in depth worked with extended trauma. And I had very, very good success with working through my trauma when I find the right therapist.
That's so fantastic to hear, especially for anybody who might be listening and wondering sort of the next steps that they could be taking, or things to try that they may not have considered yet. So that's really great advice, and really great to hear as well, obviously, because there's so much that you've needed support with, and you've managed to find that support. So that's definitely reassuring for people that might be skeptical of the social sciences and things like that. I mean, you mentioned in your correspondence to me that you were around 15 years old when you managed to move away from the group and get yourself kind of away from the Children of God. And is that typical for other people that age? Are they able to do the same? Are the third generation people that age looking to move away, or are they kind of sticking around and following in their kind of their parents' footsteps?
No, it was definitely quite unique. I was definitely very young. So I will say this, right? For the second generation, first of all, they were growing up, especially the older ones like my mom, in a much more insular world. Our prophet died in 1995, and his wife took over with her whole own brand of crazy, but it got a little less sort of isolated, and we were a little more leaning in on the missionary thing, which meant we were exposed to the outside world, which again makes it easier to leave. But in some cases with the second generation, they could get out as teenagers because they had family to go back to, right? So for most of them, they had grandparents that had lost their own children to a cult and had 12 grandchildren they'd never met or hardly knew, and they were more than happy to have those children come back, right?
Yeah.
My family was the cult, right? Like my grandfather still runs the finances for the vestiges of whatever exists of the Children of God. And so it was very rare. Like I started making my plan to get away when I was 11, but I thought for sure I had to wait till I was 18, just because I didn't have anyone on the outside.
Yeah.
And when I was 15, just, you know, went through my rebellious teenager years, had some very, very bad stuff happen to me. And I was like, that's it. I'm done. I'm out. And so I sort of like launched this rebellion, because the great thing about a cult is like they can't have anybody there sowing doubt or acting out. And so you act out enough and you get kicked out. Incidentally, once again, this also happens in the military, right? But so I was sort of invited to leave or excommunicated when I was 15. And fortunately, because I mentioned I have so many siblings, and a lot of them are through what I call cult math. So my mom was married at 20, was married to a man who was 40 and had 7 older daughters. And so I had a stepsister who I had literally met only 3 times, who had already left the cult, and which we called the family, right? So she'd already left the family, and she was living in Texas. And so when the leadership realized that there was no longer a place for me in that world, right? And basically what that looks like is at 15, I was forced to choose between my religion and everything I knew and like my desire to literally go to high school. Like that was my big rebellion, was I wanted to go to high school and college. And of course we were essentially a no schooling organization because Jesus was coming back and you didn't need an education.
Okay.
So I launched my rebellion wanting to go to school. And then my sister, my stepsister, let me essentially come crash on her couch, and she would be my guardian while I was just thrust into a world I knew nothing about.
Wow. Oh my goodness. To go to mainstream education when you have like no experience of education and be interacting with people outside of, well, interacting with the system, as the family would have called it. I can't imagine again how that must be for somebody. And are they not scared that you're just going to leave straight away and tell everybody what happens inside the commune? How does that work?
So yes and no, right? So definitely, I will say I have a whole chapter on this in my book, about when I get to high school and I show up to enroll, and they look at my passport and my social security card, which are like the only two pieces of information I had. You know, I have no school records and never had a vaccination, and they're just like, we can't enroll you. You don't exist. You know, and so that was just a process in and of itself. And I would say, yes, they're worried, right? So at first, when I started causing trouble, it was get her out of here. But then I think they realized like, oh no, like I was famous in my own right because, well, one, it's a small community, but we were in this commune that was in charge of making like propaganda videos, essentially.
Okay.
There was a lot, you know, if you read on the Children of God, it was like there was a lot of literature, a lot of videos for internal use, and then a lot of for selling on the streets and stuff like that. Right. Just like religious kids videos and stuff. And so I was a basically exploited child actor for the first 10 years of my life.
Okay.
And so, and my dad, or my stepfather at the time, was a very famous, like he was an illustrator and musician. And so literally everybody, all 10,000 members in our world knew who my dad was.
Okay.
And so Daniella, the daughter of so-and-so and so-and-so, the oldest third generation kid who we just did an article on a year ago, is now becoming a backslider, which is what we called it. From the Bible verse, no man having put his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God, which is what the chapter of my book is called, Not Fit for the Kingdom of God. And so they did try to kind of like, it was funny, they had this whole campaign to like cycle all these like young women leaders through who are like my mom's age, so like 26 or whatever, 26 to 30, like cycle them through and try to sort of convince me, reinvigorate me to stay. And once again, I had a similar experience when I decided as a captain that I was going to hang up my hat and get out of active duty of the U.S. Army. And you have a lot of leaders that try to convince you to stay. And those two experiences were pretty parallel for me as well. But then at the same time, I would also say, no, they aren't that scared, because first of all, it's pretty freaking hard to build a platform where people will actually listen to you. You know, I've been actively doing it now for 5 years, and it's only now that I have the book and am getting the interviews. And trust me, both cult people and military people are scared about what's going to be in the book. But they also, cult-wise, like they're so insulated, and it's so easy for them to be able to just be like, well, don't read the book.
Yeah.
So every time somebody would leave and would go off and do like a big expose, it was just demonize them inside the cult and nobody will read their stuff. So, very significantly in 1993, this man goes on Larry King Live and is talking about the cult. And it's an episode called Preachers or Pedophiles or something. And he admits, he's trying to give Larry King the depth of what is going on still at the time. And he admits to, being forced to have sex with a 10-year-old girl because the leaders sort of made him do it. And at the time, his name was Watchman in the cult, and he was completely demonized. He was public enemy number one. Everything he said was a lie. And a few years later, he took his own life. So that was proof. And of course, it wasn't a lie. What he said was true. And my mom was the girl that he was talking about.
Okay.
And so my mom, in the cult was like 20 or 23 at this time. And she's watching it and she knows it's true.
Yeah.
But she's also being told by her leadership that it's all a lie. And that's of cognitive dissonance and control that they do have over.
That's like extreme gaslighting as well. Like,
absolutely.
That this physical encounter has happened, but it didn't actually because this man's a liar. That's another thing hard to wrap your head around that concept as well. So I don't understand how there were never. I mean, or maybe there were, and that's the next question to ask is whether there were. And I know a lot of these compounds have now moved overseas where laws are different and people that leave a group in another country and kind of move back to the States or may not be whistleblowing in the same way that this man did on the Larry King show. But were there never any raids or any law enforcement investigations that came about from people leaving and saying this is what's happening inside these compounds?
So there definitely were. So there were people that tried to get their children back after they left because the cult definitely had a policy of like, if you decide to backslide, that's fine, but you have to leave your children here, especially if only one member was leaving. And so some people basically did it. They were like, I have to get out for my survival. And then when they were out, they were like, oh, I need my children. And so they came back and they tried to get custody. And that's usually what led to the legal battles.
Right.
And so there were raids in London, and there was a big court case called, you can find it's called the Decision of Justice Ward, where in the end, the Children of God won all the court cases, and they proved that they were not proved in heavy quotations, of course, that they were not a dangerous environment for children. And this is where, religious freedom starts to get really sticky. And this is why ultimately this is why Scientology called themselves a religion, right? Because you are so protected, especially in the United States, by the concept of religious freedom. But it's also important to note, and I do a lot of explaining of this in my book, that like we were raised to believe that the outside world was evil, that cops were horrible, that everyone was out to get us, and that no matter how hard our life might be inside the family, life in the system was so much worse.
Right.
And we had these doctrines called Deceivers Yet True, and these kids comics, Heaven's Girl and Victory in Babylon. Literally after this one big raid in Argentina, they drew up a comic book, which my dad was one of the illustrators, that was literally a script for children to memorize, essentially, about how to talk to authorities.
Oh my!
And how to lie to authorities about your life. And this is always the case for children, or nearly always the case for children that grow up in abusive environments. The outside is still scarier. Mm-hmm. You still love your parents no matter how difficult your life is. And so being taken away from them is still the hardest thing. And even when it comes to my decision to leave, like I said, like I wanted to leave since the age of 6 or started making my plan at 11, but I couldn't tell my parents that. Like I couldn't break their hearts that way. Because, at the time, like you don't know you're in a cult and you're rejecting is the right thing to do. Like you were just like, I just don't want this lifestyle anymore, but I don't want to break my parents' heart.
No, and there's obviously been no opportunity at this point for you to interact with people on the outside and also to do your own research on what is typical and what is not typical of somebody's childhood and safe environments. And obviously you knew at the age of 6 that something was wrong and that you weren't going to stay there and you were going to leave at some point. But until you have the opportunity to get some distance from a group and do your own independent research and learn and interact with people who have had different upbringings and different belief systems and different ideologies, like you can't put all these things together until you have all of the pieces of the puzzle.
And
which you didn't have at the age of 6 or probably even at the age of 15 when your sister took you in.
Yeah, absolutely not. And I have this moment in my book where I'm in high school. It's like my first day of high school. And I've been telling myself for, a few weeks trying to fit into America that like, oh, I grew up in Brazil, like I'm from Brazil. I'm from Mexico. Like I'm from a different country. Like I just need to figure this out. And I just realized I was hearing these 2 teenagers have just basically like a debate, like a disagreement. And I was like, I don't know how to think like that.
Wow. Oh,
and
my
it
goodness.
hit me this exact thought. I said, oh, I'm not from a different country. I'm from a different planet. And that is so much different. And
yeah, absolutely.
To your point, I think very importantly, most cult survivors that I know who were born and raised in it, like they are not public with the fact that they grew up. And I know some people who's like married partners don't even know their background.
Wow.
And I did this. I mean, I'm a sharer, so my friends always sort of knew, but I wasn't really public about it until well into my Army career, a good 12 years probably after I left the cult. And to your point, what you said, it's like you have to talk to other people. You have to realize there are other ways of thinking. And I really don't think that if you are closeted about your background, being in the closet is never a comfortable place. And so I struggled for 10 years where people just really didn't like me. And I think so much of it was because I was so weird and stuff about me was just off, but nobody could figure it out.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And I kind of had this amazing flip when I just started being public about it. And I just started saying, you know what, you guys, I grew up in a cult. And I've since realized that this applies to so many things, but asking someone to educate you is an amazing way to disarm them, right? Everybody loves to be an expert.
Absolutely.
So if you say some cultural reference and I don't get it.
I was going to ask about that. Yeah, like, oh, have you listened to the new Beyonce song? And you'd be like, what are those words in that sentence? Because I didn't understand any of them.
Literally the question that would send panic through my entire body in high school was somebody asking me what kind of music I liked.
Oh my goodness.
Which now you'll know because you follow me on Twitter. I have this thing I'm doing where as I'm writing each chapter of my life, I ask people to like curate or give me suggestions of music to listen to. So I'm like curating all these Spotify playlists. Music for these different phases in my life. But yeah, so I really think it, and it's, being public doesn't mean you have to write a book or be on the speaking circuit like I'm doing. Like a lot of survivors are like, well, I don't talk about it because that doesn't, I'm a lawyer or I'm a doctor or I'm whatever, a teacher, and that doesn't play into my life.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, like, when you are living a lie it's really, really hard to make close connections.
Yeah,
because you're always trying to keep track of what lie you told, essentially.
Yeah, and I suppose on some level, people can sense, whether it's intuition or whatever word you'd want to put to it, that people can often sense when somebody's not being authentic. And I think sometimes people can take that personally and be like, why is it me that you're not being authentic with, or why are you kind of shying away from these questions I'm asking you? Is it do you have a problem with me personally? Everybody, it tends to take things, and I suppose that's natural as well, tends to take things on a personal level. So if you're kind of concealing that part of your life from people, they might think, well, if she doesn't want to be authentic with me, then I'm just gonna not get on with her, for 10 years. And then when you start to open up to people and say, actually, these are my experiences and this was my life, people are like, oh, okay. So it's nothing to do with me. Actually, it's all of these things that you've experienced.
Yes, that's exactly it. And I do talk about this a bit in my TED Talk, where it's like 10 years in to being out of the cult, and I was like, I just got to put my head down and survive, right? I just got to be successful. There's 10,000 people hoping that I'm going to fail and come crawling back. I will not give them that satisfaction. And then 10 years in, I'm literally sitting on a guard tower in Afghanistan, wanting to kill myself, trying to decide how I'm going to kill myself, because I was so exhausted from not fitting in with people, right? And I mean, I'd had all kinds of traumas. I'd been assaulted again at war. I'd lost a bunch of my friends on my combat team. There was all kinds of legit trauma, but my feeling at the time was just, I'm so exhausted. I'm never going to be normal, right? I'm a cult kid, and I'm tired. I want it to end. And when I realized I needed to just start connecting with people, and I needed to just start telling people, it really is that what you said. And I think especially in my case, I'm so outgoing, I'm so bubbly, and then people ask me a question and they see me just shudder my eyes and shut down, right? They don't understand why. But as soon as I start talking about my background to people, there was also this really beautiful thing that happened. And it started because a friend of mine told me to get the F over myself. I wasn't as different as I thought I was.
Wow. Okay.
And that was, it was a military colleague, so a little tough love.
Mm-hmm.
But that was really important for me. And I actually identify that as something that helped me turn the corner, because it's really true. And there's this phrase that I love from what we call a gold star wife, which is someone who's lost their spouse in war. And she said, everyone's worst thing is their worst thing. Yeah. And I have really noticed that, right? It's maybe people can't understand growing up in a cult, but everyone can understand trauma, right?
Yeah.
Everyone has had that experience. I describe it as, Casey, maybe you can't imagine growing up in a cult, but you can probably imagine being a 6-year-old girl and wishing you had secret fake parents that were going to show up one day and take you away to a different life. And that's why Disney is $1 billion industry, right?
Yeah.
And so I found that since I started sharing my stories, so many people can relate to it. And so many people have had these interesting parallel experiences. And that's basically what my book Uncultured kind of is. It's let me tell you about these extreme circumstances I've had in my life, but the parallels to group behavior, and especially the trauma that group behavior can cause. Everyone has experienced that in some way in their life.
And it definitely has been brought to my attention, the parallels that you've been drawing here. And it has crossed my mind to speak about the military in the past, especially because when it comes to things like hazing rituals, I've thought about talking about sororities and fraternities and boarding schools as well, like private schools. I think I'm probably going to have to go out now and find a group of people who are ex-military from around the world and speak to them about their experiences and see if the methods of control are similar for them as well in the way that you've explained it, because there seems to be a whole demographic of people here that would fit the profile of the podcast that might want to get their stories out. And you mentioned before as well that not everybody's going to be wanting to discuss that part of their life with people, and not everybody's going to be a talker or a sharer, or maybe it just doesn't play a part in their life's narrative now. But thank goodness there are people like you that are coming forward to speak about it, because those people that don't can still identify with people who have had similar experiences and can still build a community of support and still find a network, or just know that there are other people out there that have had these experiences, because there is a handful of people such as yourself who will come forward and speak on these types of platforms and put a pen to paper and write these experiences down, so that others know that that they aren't the only people that might be thinking or feeling the same way that you have thought and felt. And I just think that's so commendable.
Yeah.
So it's so important.
And I think the analogy of sort of like being closeted with your sexuality is very helpful here, because if you think about, people that are LGBTQ plus, like not all of them are super public or super obvious, right? So I'm not saying that that's what people have to be. Like, you never have to share anything you don't want to share, like with the public or with anyone. But from an internal perspective, right? If you still haven't even been honest with yourself about who you are, or your like close people in your life. Like I had an entire marriage where I didn't really talk about my past and he didn't really want to hear about it. And that of course did not go very well for many reasons.
No, I mean, we get one life, I'm assuming anyway, from my perspective and my beliefs and my values. You're on this planet one time. Imagine spending that lifetime not being authentic and carrying a part of yourself around that you're not, that maybe you're not even being truthful to yourself. I can't imagine how exhausting that must be, and also just how much better it would feel to just be like, do you know what, this is me, all of me, and I'm kind of not ashamed or worried about any of it. That to have that moment must feel great, whether it's around sexuality or saying to people, I grew up in a cult, or whatever your personal situation may be. There's been a lot of women that I've worked with that a community group in the past that have gone through therapy for abortion. That's obviously a huge taboo subject that women don't openly discuss and talk about, but it has such huge effects on women's mental health. And because it's not something they can discuss openly, it often ends up kind of eating them from the inside out until they end up with severe mental health problems. So even things like that, to just say like, I'm an abuse survivor, or I don't know, to carry something around and not talk about it, like I want to marry somebody from, this who is the same sex as me. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to marry someone of the opposite sex because that's what my church expects of me. I don't know. It's just, it must just be so tiring to live that kind of life.
Well, and it's even, when you look at like women in the military, right? It's, in the US, we are at the unfortunate state of events where, being sexually assaulted in uniform is literally almost a hazard of duty. Mm-hmm. We're at 1 in 4, 1 in 3, 1 in 4, and we suspect it's 1 in 2 at least, right?
Yeah. There must be so many people that don't even come forward through either fear or
it's always,
denial even.
Yes, and it's always been, as a woman who served, you're almost like expected to choose, am I going to identify myself as an assault victim, or am I going to be a proud veteran? And I got told this, like, Daniella, you're a captain, you're successful, you're one of the first women in combat, like, just stick to that. Don't talk about the cult. And And even now, I think it's interesting with my book. I'm like, no, I'm doing both.
Yeah, well, obviously
I made history and in the military. I have a medal from President Obama. Like, I'm a very proud veteran. Also, let's talk about rape culture. Let's talk about these experiences that women have in the military, and let's talk about them in public. And since I've been doing that, I mean, an unbelievable amount of both support, calls for change, but also other men and women that have experienced the same things. So I think when you start to open yourself and be vulnerable and refuse to let people put you in a box and tell you what to do with your voice, you start to meet other people who have shared these sort of same essential human experiences.
Yeah.
And you can start to heal.
And it's not to say that anybody that is kind of living with some part of themselves that they've decided to conceal or has to remain concealed for some one reason or another. It's not me saying, just open up and be honest, because I obviously for some people it's not as easy as just kind of just talking about it or just opening up or just being honest and truthful. There could be people in situations where that's unfortunately not an option for them. But I'm just coming at it from my perspective. And I always want to make sure that people know that I'm trying to be kind of not judgmental of people's choices and stuff. So I just wanted to quickly make a point to anybody listening that might be thinking, well, it's not as easy as that to just come forward and say, this is my life. And but I think what is fantastic is that there are people such as yourself, Daniella, that will come forward and say, like, if it is something that you're able to do, this is how you can do it. And you're an example of somebody that's come forward and said, like, and even for the military to say, you're a fantastic woman, but we don't want to hear about the first half of your life. We're only interested in the second half where you're serving the military. That's absolute, like, pardon my language, but that's bullshit, because everybody's journey leads them, and experiences and personality and everything is kind of, obviously it's all nature and nurture. So you wouldn't have been able to serve the military in the way that you did or have the insight that you do now if it wasn't for the experiences that you had throughout your entire life. So how can they just say, like, the first half of your life is not something people want to hear about? Yeah, it's probably, as you said before, what made you so successful and come first in everything, or successful in the military's eyes. And in the education system's eyes, to come first in everything and strive to be at the top.
Right. And also it's very, it's very culty and very problematic in group behavior, especially to try to paint things as white and black.
Yes.
Right. And so this is why now my decision is, no, I don't choose, or, in the military, again, part of my language, because this might sound harsh, but when I was coming through the Army and it was extremely sexist and still segregated and all that, and they would say in basic trainings, my drill sergeant said to me this horrible sort of joke that is, women in the Army are either a bitch, a slut, or a dyke. Wow. You get to choose, right? And the implication is we're programming women that you have to be a stone cold bitch. You have to be hard all the time. Like, you can't have friends. You can't let people know the real you. And, sort of in my book and in my life now, I'm just like, nope, sorry, I don't choose. I choose all, like, I'm going to be me, and everything about me made me part of who I am.
Yeah.
And I have this conversation publicly with a lot of people that will, like, find me on Twitter because they like, I'm sort of almost like live tweeting this Harvard graduate degree where I'm studying leadership and group behavior and all this stuff, and people will love that. But then the second I start talking about being a mom or being a rape victim or being whatever, they're like, oh, now I'm turned off. And
you can't have some of it. It's the whole package. And as like you said, there's no more putting you in a box. You can't be one of those three things that person in the military suggested you should be just because of your gender.
Yeah. And we especially do this to women, just like in our society at large, where it's like, oh, if you want to be taken seriously, if you want to be whatever, like you have to be this.
Yeah.
And just like, no, all of my experiences made me what I am.
You have to be sort of hard-faced or cold-faced, or you have to sleep with your boss. And when he approaches you and says, I can do favors for you if you can do favors for me, you have to say yes, because that's the way women get ahead. And those types of things make me feel sick.
Yeah. And, what's so amazing is I feel like that's changing. And I feel
absolutely.
like
definitely.
The women that I see now that are the lieutenants and the captains that are, me 10 years ago are so powerful and so incredible and challenging authority and letting people know what is and isn't appropriate in ways that, of course, I, was not able to do. Especially when you're the first ones through the barriers, like you have to be perfect. Mm-hmm. And perfect is defined through men's eyes right now. Mm-hmm. And we're working on changing all that. But, a big part of the challenge I'm navigating now with my book is going to be with the military and the military community and getting them to see, look, you've all sworn publicly to start addressing your culture and start dealing with the harmful parts. Nobody's suggesting that the U.S. military branches are not sort of like honorable organizations. They are, and they've done great things for our country, but there are serious, serious problems in them, and we can start addressing it, but not unless you're willing to listen to my story, read my story, and read the stories of other people like me.
Yeah.
And start to really, really ask, when one of our first women that we're so proud of is being sent out on combat patrols, and we're warning her to watch her back against the 25 men she's being sent out with, like, that's a culture problem.
Yeah,
absolutely. That's not a individual bad apples. It's not like, oh, Daniella's just so unlucky. It's like, that's a culture problem. And we need to start addressing that so that we can keep these amazing women, because the military can't keep women. It's, most of us get out as captains. It's very, very rare that women are staying past about 10 years, because it's just too much. It's just too hard. And none of it's physical, by the way. It's all the environment and the way that women are treated.
Well, I suppose things like the Me Too movement have definitely helped with moving those messages along and making it more normalized to come forward and speak about those types of experiences that shouldn't have to happen or shouldn't be happening in the first place. And it's like you said, I think, again, there's another parallel there with the military in terms of things like religion and Christianity. Things, I talk a lot about different denominations and sects of Christianity. And a lot of the people I interview will be talking about them in a negative light. And that's not to say that Christianity overall is evil. Who I don't know if we can say whether it truly is or not, but there are certainly some parts of Christianity that are exploiting, abusing, isolating, and using coercive control methods on its members, and parts of scripture and doctrine, and manipulating those words to justify what they're doing within those groups. And it's it's not to say that the military overall is an evil entity, but from what you've said, there are certainly parts of it that use those same methods of control. And those things have to change across religion, military, and groupthink overall. From what you've said about your entrepreneurship and training in that part of your life.
Well, yes, exactly. And, here's the thing, right? Like human beings are hardwired to get into groups. And I think we developed that because groups are stronger than individuals. And so it was an evolutionary thing that we get into groups. And I haven't found any evidence yet that a cult is sort of fundamentally different from any other group, right? And so it's all psychology, and you really can't protect against it as much as you can just know how to kind of guard yourself. And one of the things I always say, to your point there, is hold nothing sacred.
Mm-hmm.
So for an organization, right? And this is, again, my challenge to the U.S. Army and militaries of just all kinds, is hold nothing sacred, right? Like, I love the U.S. Army just like the current leaders do. But if you're not willing to sort of listen to our stories, and we did, the American military women, we had our own Me Too movement when a young woman was killed, buried in multiple graves, and then not looked for 60 days, Vanessa Guillen. And we sort of responded to that with hashtag I am Vanessa Guillen, and we all just started telling our stories.
Yeah.
And for the military to really sort of see and really sort of realize that we can't just keep putting our heads in the sand and saying we're not a cult, we're a great organization.
Yes. And having the military investigate itself as well, as opposed to kind of outside independent people coming in to do those investigations as well.
Right. Yes, that's obviously so problematic.
Wow, there's so much around the military that I hadn't even considered. So I really am looking forward to your book Uncultured, which is there's as you said, your publishers are going to be discussing it and kind of doing a pre-launch and advertising it around from September of this year, 2021, and it's due to be released next year in 2022. Is that right?
Yeah, more information to follow.
Yeah, tentatively.
So yes, so book publishing is its whole own little group world that's fun to learn about. But essentially, I got the book deal in March, so the book is currently like in the process of being written.
Okay.
So it's publishing is an extremely collaborative art, right? So it goes through all kinds of stuff. But yes, so right now, what listeners can do if they're interested in reading Uncultured, which I promise you I'm working hard to make very phenomenal, is if you're a Goodreads person, you can find already kind of a shell of Uncultured by Daniella Mestyanek Young on Goodreads, and you can add it to your want to reads list, because then you'll get information there. They can go to DanielaMestyanekYoung.com and put their email in, and we can, link that in show notes. And then they can also find me on Twitter, Daniella M. Young. I'm extremely active. I have all kinds of conversations with people, and I will definitely be putting book information out there. But yes, this hopefully this fall, there's a lot. You start hearing about it a lot more through wherever you get your books. And then hopefully about a year after that, there's a book people can buy.
Yes, absolutely. And we'll definitely be keeping an eye on updates for that. Your emails to me, they come with all of those links that you've just mentioned. So I'll take all of those from our email thread and put those in the episode description for anybody who might be looking to follow the news of the book, or find your TEDx talk Lost in Transition, which I recommend everybody go and watch on YouTube because it's so insightful and moving. And I watched it and was just like, whoa, because I didn't know what to expect, and it was sort of my first introduction to you and your life and your story, and it's amazing. And what you speak about with transitions in terms of groups and cults is so spot on as well from everybody that I've spoken to. So yeah, definitely I'll put the link to that in the group in the episode description, as well as the the calendar link that people can use to sign up for updates on your memoir on culture that hopefully we'll be able to get our hands on in a year or so. So my last question to you, Daniella, before we finish today is to just ask you what advice you would give to people who may be looking to leave their high control group or have left recently and are looking for what to do next, and what advice you might give to those people if they were to ask for it.
Yeah, so my biggest tip, and I can't remember if I mentioned this earlier, but this is for everyone, whether you think you're in a cult or not, right? Is to start hold nothing sacred, right? Like there is no idea, there is no dogma, there is no religion that cannot stand being questioned and beat up a little. And if it can't, then you should know that that's a problem, right? And that's especially true after you've just left the cult or the organization or the high control group or whatever it is, because there is no way humanly possible that you know all of the factors at play in your own mind or your own socialization. And I've determined that it takes like about a decade, right, to process everything. So, you know, my tips are hold nothing sacred and do the work. Whatever that looks like for you, right? But you need to read a lot of books. You need to talk to a variety of people. It doesn't necessarily have to be about your high control group experience, but you have to surround yourself with different people from different walks of life that challenge you and challenge your ideas. And that's really the only way that any of us are going to survive the increasing polarization and isolation of our world now. You know, hopefully we get a handle on technology and what it's doing to us. But right now, I mean, you can curate any feed of anything you're on to be an echo chamber. And so we're all, you know, the last chapter of my book is called The Cults Among Us, right? Like we're all in an idea cult of some kind, and or at least the potential to be an idea cult. And so unless you know that, and unless you can see the parallels, which is really what I hope my book will do, is show you the parallels between my extreme life and your normal life, and see where groupthink is at work in your mind, and then start to challenge it and just hold nothing sacred, read broadly, and do the work.
Amazing. I think that's great advice. And we touched on therapy earlier and the types of therapy that the people might want to look for and approach. And I just quickly wanted to ask you to speak about resources that might be accessible for second, third, fourth generation members of groups that were born into their movement, because I know a lot of the resources that I mentioned will be for people that perhaps joined their groups later on in life. And as a third generation member yourself, I just wondered if there was anything that you could direct people towards if they were born into their movement.
Yes. Okay. So for everyone who's listening, there's an organization called the International Cultic Studies Association. That's very, very good. And you don't need to do anything to join. You can just get on their mailing list. And it's, you know, sort of an academic organization that does a lot of research around cults. But they have, or had prior to COVID, and I've not like attended this, but I think it's fascinating, is they do like yearly retreats for second and third generation members. And I mean, I think just knowing that second and third generation or fourth or whatever, like have a very, very different experience. And so if you are one, you have to honor that, and you have to go do sort of the same readings, you know, start with the ICSA. There's also George Washington University has a very interesting program on extremism. And because we're seeing sort of like this confluence or this coming together of cult think and radicalization and extremism and white supremacy and terrorism and all of these things coming together right now. So if you're someone that's interested in sort of like learning about how that works, and I think for cult survivors, it's a very important part, is like learning why it worked on you. Those are two resources. And then I think a big thing for second and third generation survivors, and many people will say this, this is also true for veterans, by the way, it's like you have to find other survivors. You have to find, just like you have to find connections on the outside world and people that know your truth, you also have to find your group of people that grew up the same way as you, because once you get out of that, it starts to kind of seem like a dream, right? It's so extreme, it's so removed. And there really are, you know, I have wonderful friends. I have a wonderful husband who's done so much work with me, but he can never really understand just the insanity of what my life was like. And so I have support groups of Children of God survivors, and we kind of, from all around the world, you know, just keep each other going and give each other that validation of, yes, we really did experience that. It really was that crazy. And I can make the same analogy for like people that have been in a military and been to war, right? It's like you do need people on the outside that can ground you to the real world, but you also need people who have been through the same awful things that you've been through, that can just understand you and can laugh about it and can give you their tips and can pick up the phone when you're suicidal or panicking and just not judge you.
Absolutely. I think having some sort of support network, whether it's a face-to-face meetings that you're able to have, or phone calls, or even a forum. I talk about Reddit all the time. There's subreddits for so many of these groups that we speak about on the show that are there waiting for people to go and access and find like-minded people to speak with about their experiences and everything. So thank you so much, Daniella, for your time today, especially, but for writing your memoir and your TEDx talk and you know, all of the things that you're doing to be an advocate for others who may not be in a position to come forward and speak. I am just so appreciative of you and your story and sharing it and coming here today and trusting me with your information and just, you know, making more of a safe space for others who may have experienced similar things. I always say that I think it's so commendable that people are so brave to come forward and speak about it, especially to somebody that they don't know personally, that they've never met. So I appreciate you and your time. I'm just really thankful.
Well, you're quite welcome, and you know, back at you. Thanks for giving me the platform and for doing the work that you do. This is also important, and the more intentional we are about understanding ourselves and what's at play in our lives and our psychology, you know, the happier we are going to be on our one go around the planet. Right?
Absolutely, definitely, yeah. Well said. We will keep our ears to the ground and eyes on the screens for updates on your book, and I can't wait to share it around to my small platform when we get those updates. So thank you so much, Daniella, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.